so I spoke in thin air. I will not do introductions. I'll quickly go to the panelists because I believe we wasted some time. Mathiv, if I could come to you, because as you know, this panel basically looks at the problem of violent extremism from non-security measures. What do you think, firstly, up front, the role that education and can play in countering violent extremism? How early must the intervention for CVE really begin?
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you to ORF for inviting me and all of us here today. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of education's role at the Institute, we believe it's utterly fundamental if we're going to realistically confront the developments of extremism. I was just reminding myself of the Christchurch call, and it spoke of strengthening the resilience and inclusiveness of our societies to enable them to resist terrorist and violent extremist ideologies. And education is a massive opportunity to do that, as the call acknowledges. There are several key areas I think we need to look at this and address. It's crucial to look at both what is taught and how it is taught. It's crucial to advance programmatic work. It's utterly important to assess that. It's an incredibly difficult area to evaluate. Education is often hijacked by people for all sorts of reasons, not just for this reason, but it's very frequently hijacked by extremists and those that would seek to propagate narratives that are difficult and troubling. We see that throughout history. And also then it's really crucial to make policy changes that begin to ensure that our education spaces are those that both safeguard children from destructive ideologies and also make them more resilient in order to make our communities more resilient. It's very important to acknowledge that education doesn't exist in a vacuum. It can't be the silver bullet, and nothing can, we know, on this issue, or the panacea, and we can't sort of just blame education systems for causing all the problems. But I think because, the opportunity to reach so many through education systems, we must really begin to assess them and take international responsibility and learn from good practices. So at the Institute, we have a number of programmatic approaches to education. Our biggest program is called Generation Global, that works in about 35 countries, including here in India, also in Pakistan and Bangladesh. We equip teachers with the skills of critical thinking and dialogue, which they're then able to pass on to their students, and then provide opportunities for engagement with the other through virtual exchange. So much of this destructive ideologies rely on the othering, the reduction of the other, the negative view of the others, the scapegoating of the other. So providing those interactions is crucial to begin to build that resilience so young people can navigate difficult conversations. That program's been running for 10 years. In the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of our teachers have been coming to us and saying, we really need also help with engaging in the really difficult dialogues, and not least around extremism. So we've developed a number of resources, both in-house and with external partners, that not only allow teachers training them in the pedagogy of having deep dialogue on difficult issues, but also provide them with the skill set. Teachers aren't experts in violent extremism. Teachers aren't experts in anti-Semitism necessarily, so they need that skill set. So we provide webinars and training both on the ground and using technology to do that.
I'll go to Saiful, if I may ask you. What's your organization, what's the nature of the work of your organization? And how do you think it's really important in in a mobilization against countering violent extremism. If you can give us a perspective from a Bangladeshi experience.
Thank you. Ours is the kind of first ever youth-led CV organization which has started working in Bangladesh. We primarily focused on the Qawmi Madrasa students in our country, which are private seminaries and kind of maintain a pretty regimented lifestyle and education curricula. So we wanted to provide them with civic education training with covering subjects like basic citizenship understanding, then basic police law, how could they become kind of a responsible citizen. At the same time, we are providing hands-on training on CV issues and media literacy things. And after that, we take them for a week-long extensive paralegal training so that they can learn more about the legal aspects. And the basic premise for that was, since you know that among the couple of the Muslims, there is understanding that Quran is the only constitution that we should follow. But when we started sharing the idea that you need, the country need a constitution which actually works as a kind of administrative guideline to run the country, then we thought that this could be the first alternative narrative for the religious or those students who are kind of bit regimental to the new idea. So when we started this thing, we also faced some sort of backlash from them. That is altogether a different thing. But what we faced, or what we find more interesting, is the existence of lack of coordination among the different actors or stakeholders who are working on this issue. At the same time, the challenge of defining the PV and CV aspect, like who should do which work. For example, when we talk about the CVE issue, that is countering the violent extremists or their thoughts, it looks like the security agencies wanted to take the lead. They don't want, or they don't love to see the civil society actors getting involved in the process. But when we talk about the PV issues, which is preventing violent extremism, which we feel that it should be the basic thing for any society to start the DRAD programs. At the PVE stuff, we found that the agencies don't feel very interested to get engaged with. So we are in a kind of limbo, like how to carry forward the activities and whether we can have a proper coordinating model or a sort of proper job description prepared by the regional actors so that we can at least have some basic platform from where we can start with.
Jessie, coming to you, Hedayah has done some great work in the CVE field, and I would love to have the same question in mind and ask you, how do you really see it, the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of responses that you're really having on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So I was really intrigued by the title of this panel, from ideas to action and 2030. So, it's hard to predict what it's going to look like 10 years from now. I started to look back at what my life was 10 years ago from where I am now. And I can tell you what I wasn't doing. I wasn't living across the world. I wasn't living in this part of the world. As a matter of fact, I wasn't working in counterterrorism or violent extremism, and I wasn't even working at all. I was actually diagnosed with a really rare brain disease. It was incurable, most likely progressive, irreversible, and absolutely having the need to operate. How fitting to be on a panel with the neuroscientist. The disease, called moya moya in Japanese, means puff of smoke because it literally, on a CT scan, looks like someone is smoking a cigarette in your brain. Now, why did I tell you this story? You're probably wondering. It's also to keep you interested, and there is an analogy to go along with it. But to me, terrorism and violent extremism is like moya moya. Just like Moya terrorism and violent extremism, it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to be around. Just like Moya, it isn't curable. There's no magical Band-Aid to violent extremism. There's no one-size-fits-all, as we've heard from all the other panelists. And just like Moya, by the way, I don't think anyone is now going to forget this disease. Violent extremism and terrorism is progressive. Violent extremists are they're becoming savvier. We've seen that in different presentations, especially last night. But if we know this, what should we do to become more prepared? And Hedayah is doing a lot of work in this area. So in the last 10 years, there have been incredible advancements in the field of Moya, research and surgeries and techniques. There are 4 hospitals conducting surgery with 4 options available in the US when I was diagnosed. And now, 10 years later, there are multiple hospitals that are offering multiple variety of treatments now. So just as the medical field progresses, we should be progressing and evolving in the CVE world in regards to policy implementation, bringing new ideas to the field, and codifying those that work. And I want to highlight 3 of them. And these 3 are 3 things that can turn into action that Hedayah is working on. First, I think we can all agree upon the UN General Secretary's call to action for member states to produce a national action plan. But what I want to emphasize is that every country shouldn't just produce a national action plan, but they should also be encompassing a communications plan that complements it. This is absolutely where we can affect change and where we can bring new ideas to the table. Second, under this communications plan, it needs to be developed holistically. It can't be a top-down approach. At Hedayah, we work with governments, grassroots societies, women, media, youth, and various organizations and stakeholders to ensure that they are part of the process. Think macro in the sense of this communications plan. This includes messaging campaigns, CVE programming, PVE education, digital media and literacy programming. But in addition to this overarching plan, there also needs to be 2 additional parallel plans. There needs to be one external plan that is communicated to the public that explains what the National Action Plan is. And there also needs to be an internal communications plan that is targeted and that is encompassing for the government. And this is often overlooked. This in turn creates a holistic communications approach that effectively puts policy into action. And then third, for fresh ideas or even older ideas to become sustainable, there needs to be a mentorship process. We can run dozens of campaigns, but if the people that are running these campaigns don't know how to monitor or evaluate, or don't know how to do evidence-based research, content creation, then what's the point? We've wasted valuable resources, time, and energy. If governments are not communicating one message, which I've seen before, to the general public, and different ministries are saying different things to different people, to the media, who are the public to trust? If civil society isn't included in the communications strategic development process, why should they care? A mentorship for the overarching communications plan can be simple and direct. So let's go back to the Moya analogy because it's kind of fun to say, and everyone probably, or maybe not, has either Googled it or may Google it later. By the way, you probably do not have it, but no promises. Just like the disease will always be there, terrorism and violent extremism is always going to be here. However, that doesn't mean that we need to be static in our approach for the next 10 years. So besides now learning of a new ailment, you now know 3 specific actions that can be taken and turned into policy implementation. And this is something at Hedayah that we found that is not only wanted, but desperately needed and repeatedly requested. So I hope by 2030, dozens of countries will have developed and implemented communication plans that complement their national action plan. And maybe, just maybe, in 10 years from now, treatments for moya, violent extremism, and terrorism will be a little bit different than it is now.
General Ratnayake, you're someone who's been a part of kinetic operations, I presume, because you were a part of the Sri Lankan army. But at the same time, you were also involved in the rehabilitation of LTTE fighters. So in a sense, you have played 2 kinds of movies. One is Rambo and the other is Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. And I take this liberty because I feel the audience are a little sleepy after a sumptuous lunch. And I want to ask you, is a military defeat the ultimate defeat to violent extremism, or can we really go beyond the kinetics and the combat to deal with this problem? Because what we have is that a lot of response to countering violent extremism is basically based on the security and kinetic kind of ways of dealing with it. How do you really see your experience in Sri Lanka now that you have a new challenge that has come up? And what lessons can we learn so that the road towards 2030 can be a little more peaceful?
Yeah, thank you. A lot of people believe in the world that terrorism cannot be defeated. And the other thing that people believe, even during the discussions today and yesterday, people think that those radicalized people cannot be de-radicalized or rehabilitated. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have lessons to share with you. We defeated terrorism. We achieved the other objective as well. We de-radicalize the people who got involved. So here, Sri Lanka is a country has 21 million people, 3 major communities, Sinhalese, Tamil, and Muslims. Sinhalese around 79%, and Tamil is around 14%, and the Muslims around 9%. So initially in 1971, Sinhalese community, Marxist-driven insurgency came up, and they wanted to take over the government, throw away the government which was democratically elected, and they wanted to come into power. So that was within 3 months crush. The army was not a very full-fledged professional kind of an army, but we had a ceremonial outfit, but still we managed to do that. So it's same thing. Then we had conducted a rehabilitation program. We had about 8 to 10,000 people. We rehabilitated them and reintegrated, but still the same political party again came back and tried to overthrow the government in 1988-89. Insurgency came back. So again, military got involved and crushed it also and handed over to the government. This time, the rehabilitation program went on well. There were about 15 to 20,000 people. So the program conducted for now 27 years, they have not come up, and that political party which came out with violent activities today is a democratic party, the third biggest party in the country and in the mainstream of democracy. So it was a successful rehabilitation program in my personal opinion. So then 1980, the northern insurgency, the Tamil community, a group from the Tamil community came up with the idea of separating the country. And they wanted to separate, and they resorted into terrorism. So the organization, there were 42 militant organizations of fighting against the government. And at the end, except the Tamil LTTE, popularly known as Tamil Tigers, remain, and all other organizations either perished or got into the mainstream of politics. So Tamil Tigers fought, we all know that they became the most dangerous, ruthless terrorist organization in the world, suicide bombing, all that. They are the people who invented and brought up to the level. And all suicide bombing around the country for the last 20, 30 years, if you put them together, not even 10% of what the LTTE carried out. So that is the level of suicide bombing they carried out in Sri Lanka. So that kind of an organization, they came up. They wanted to separate the country. And for 30 long years, they have been fighting. So then we have been going around the world and finding solutions. We came to India, Pakistan, US, UK, China, so Africa, and all over the world, Israel. We have been going and trying to take lessons and try to implement in Sri Lanka and eradicate terrorism. So we developed a concept of our own called humanitarian operation at the end. So government gave us 5 years. So within less than 3 years, we eradicated terrorism. We finished the Tamil Tiger terrorism as well. So these are then after that, what happened? We were left with 14,000 ex-combatants. They were minors, they were women, 2,000 women, and the rest were male cadres, from basic cadre to suicide cadre, the senior leaders and all that, highly radicalized people. So we carried out, I was given the responsibility of rehabilitating, I was made the Commissioner General Rehabilitation. We developed the concept of rehabilitation and we put that into practice. And within 2.5, 3 years, we completed. Now for the last 10 years, we have reintegrated 14,000 of them. None of them have resorted back into violence, extremism. Keep aside extremism, not even antisocial activity by any of those people. This is the level of success we achieved, ladies and gentlemen. So according to the UN, there are 32 rehabilitation programs in the contemporary history. And out of all that, according to UN, Sri Lankan program is the most successful one. And one day in a seminar, she said, the head of the UN rehabilitation program told us into an audience, the Sri Lankan program is the most successful. The program, the guidelines that the UN had developed, 90% of the guidelines were taken from the Sri Lankan experience. So this is how the value. So I will stop here. So during the discussions, we can get to know.
Sumaiya, yours is a very unique field in researching on countering violent extremism. What I believe you're trying to do is to hack into people's brains and find out why they turn violent. Could you tell us a little about your research and what the future of this field really looks like? And can we actually, through neurobiological research, really find out the triggers and behaviors which actually lead to violent extremism and be able to come up with a cure for it?
Thanks, Khalid. So it's a very journalistic thing to say that people can hack into people's brains. What we're really doing is, in psychiatry, we're trying to see what are the people who engage in violence, and violence all types across different domains. And some people could have an acquired psychopathy or an actual psychopathy that predisposes them to violence in an impulsive way that cannot be even helped. But what we're seeing is regular people, like ordinary people like you and I, going into battlefields, wanting to do, pick up guns and, do the terrible things that they're doing. And is it really different? I think we're jumping too fast, and we're trying to find really fast solutions about CVEs, but we're missing this massive hole in here. And everybody's skill set is different. Politicians and journalists and researchers and sociologists, they're putting together this, trying to solve this complex human behavior. They're forgetting that every bit of your human behavior to this point that evokes all of your physical, sensory motor processing and physiological processing, it originates from your brain. And this is something that we've been missing so far. I mean, we've used psychology, of course, But it's not, we're just talking about the mind and psychology. We're going a step ahead here. We're, using a combination of different biological research, such as genetics, epigenetics, behavior, of course, and, functional brain imaging. In my lab, we've established this paradigm where we see what could happen to them while they're actually doing something in an environment. So this is something that we're establishing, but I think it's too, I will reduce it too little if I just say that this is a biological thing only, because you have to look at a combination of different things in addition to the neurobiological research. So we're looking at cultural, environmental, social, political aspects of it. So I think everyone's trying to understand it in different ways, but we're just doing our own little thing. I think the idea is to put all of this together and then see what's the cultural context of it. And then again, we're oversimplifying it in every way. People are talking about radicalization constantly. But are we really talking about those people who go out there and become suicide bombers or pick up a gun and start shooting people? Because there's a difference between the people who are radicalized and who are nonviolent, and then there's other people who are violent and at the same time extremists. And there's huge differences between the two. Not everybody who is a radical, who is an extremist, will engage in this violent activity. So I've been speaking to former radicals, current radicals, and one of the guys who was previously associated with Islamic militancy, when he joined ISIS, he said that people were asked to fill out forms when they first went there. And one of the things that they were asking for is, are you prepared to do this? Are you prepared to be a suicide bomber, for example? Or what are you prepared to do for this? And not everybody would say yes to those things. So even when we're saying, yes, this person is extremist, without that predisposition to violence, and a lot of that predisposition comes down to, things like cultural and social aspect and biology. The nonviolent extremists are just enablers. Without those violent people, this whole idea of violent extremism is completely useless, because they're not going to be able to do anything without these people. So the focus and the definition should be really isolating who is who here. So once we're talking about violent extremists, we need to identify what are the root causes of it, right? So when we talk about ideologically driven extremism or violent extremism, we say this is like a motivational kind of reward-like behavior. So we study what causes that, and how do we study those behaviors in that particular group of people. So once we isolate that, and so it's a step-by-step process, and then we put everything together and identify. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-for-all. We have to identify in every single individual what is the root causes. And it's very simplistic to say religion is it, and socioeconomics, or just economics, but that's obviously not true either, or culture and region. Like, a lot of this is coming from the Middle East, but that's not true that only Middle East is involved in this. And a lot of them might be Islamist in origin, but again, there's other people engaging themselves. A lot of them might be poor and coming from ghettos, but the lead hijacker of 7/11 was super rich. One of the guys in Sri Lankan bombings was a spice trader's sons, and they were quite rich. There's so many privileged people. I spoke to another British Pakistani who went and joined the movement in the Middle East. He had absolutely no problems, And there's the third thing, that these might originate in some sort of trauma before, and that's why they're trying to, retaliate. So this person had absolutely no problems, had a completely privileged life, and went on and do something like that because he wanted to gain some significance in his life really fast that other people around him were doing through education and money and all that, and he just couldn't get to that point, and he wanted to attain some sort of life significance, and this was one of his ways to do that, and came from very privileged backgrounds. And someone earlier in the panel said that these are absolutely terrible conditions in the West that these people are ghettoizing in. That's actually not true. I've grown up in those conditions in Australia. I've grown up in a very Turkish kind of ghetto-like community in Australia, and that's actually not true. These kids there who are growing up in Britain, in the US, or Australia, or in Europe are quite privileged, and it is wrong to say that all of them are growing up in places that are worse than Bombay suburbs or Mumbai suburbs. So we have to identify for every single person what are your root causes, and then go bit by bit, in different ways, for each individual to see how they can be counter-radicalized or de-radicalized.
While there are lots of ideas about countering violent extremism, I believe there are two major variables here. One is an actor who proliferates violence, again an actor who tries to counter it through various means. And the second is the method. I want to run a question across this panel, is that youth are the primary stakeholders in any conversation, or any conversation that we think of having futuristically, because tomorrow's violent extremist may be today playing football somewhere, but if from this forum we take ideas towards implementation, we may actually be able to save him from becoming an extremist, or not, or basically create a scenario where such a situation doesn't arise. Keeping that in mind, how can various strands of opinion, like we have on this panel, come together towards a multi-stakeholder approach and move from ideas to action? What can be the method and methodology of that approach? I'll start from Matthew and then go around to everybody with the same question. Matthew.
Thanks, Khalid. There is a risk in all of this, and I think it's come out over the last kind of day and a half or so, that we don't know where to start. Everything is so complex, everything is so interwoven. We grapple with this the whole time. At the Institute, in our thinking of how to approach this, our theory of change is incredibly complex, and trying to navigate pathways through it to design and implement practical programs is very difficult. There needs to be strong collaboration between governments and civil society if we're going to progress. And the medium that a couple have mentioned, I think, is proper evaluation, really understanding what works and doesn't work in which communities, isolating some factors to implement, and then those things being taken up. A lot of reaction in this space. Someone called Tim Holding, who's a previous Australian politician, has done some interesting work on describing the kind of policy approach in this area, which is totally different from the way governments generally approach policy. And there's been a lot of money just thrown at it, a lot of things kind of tried there and failed. And what we're seeing at the moment, I think, is a lot of exasperation or frustration amongst the political class that programs haven't worked. Because we continue to see, or we're constantly trying to kind of prove a negative here. Because, frankly, in our program, it's more likely we'll be able to find out that, someone that participated in a program, chose to undertake some violent action, that they decided not to do it because they've taken part in the program, because everything you're trying to do is prevention. And then responses tend to be, at times, overly kinetic to actions, and then kind of thinking through, how do we, in a kind of desperate scramble. A whole of society approach is really important. We can't just focus, youth is an incredibly important constituency in this, but we've got to be very careful not to sort of blame youth or blame, there always seems a slight implication when we talk about, religious leaders need to take responsibility in this area, or youth, we need to engage youth or women, that somehow we're sort of passing the buck for this issue to them. And so what does real engagement look like? I think we've really got to struggle and grapple with that as we take policy forward in this space.
Moving on to your Saiful, I request every one of you to please keep your responses limited to 3 minutes so that we can have a Q&A from the audience as well. Saiful.
I think the social media platforms needs to come forward with removing objectionable contents from their platforms, especially the religious sermons, which spread hate on the very beginning. I think the tech companies and the social media platforms, they should sit with the youth-led organizations so that.
But is it just a conversation for the tech organizations? Because they're not the only stakeholders.
No, social media platforms and the tech companies both. They should sit together with the youth-led platforms who are actually engaging with the youths so that they can identify the contents which are kind of influencing the youths to becoming a terrorist or getting radicalized. So this is what we are missing. There is no checklist from the social media platforms. In the name of maintaining our policy, they are actually creating a generation of radical youths. So we have to be quite active in putting them on board so that they actually come with a specific proposal how they can eliminate or remove those contents from the online. Number two is the unemployment of the educated youth is kind of contributing to the shift of profile of the terrorists. So how can we actually engage the educated youth in direct programs, and what could be the role of the state in this process? It needs to be figured out. Number three is coordination between the core religious institutions operating in a particular region. It needs to be highlighted and ensured. Say, for example, in our context, in India, Deoband is the kind of the primary religious institutions for the Muslims, or especially for the madrasas. So if we can engage the Deoband in that process, and they kind of give a sort of positive vibe that, okay, you need to accept this type of activities in your religious institutions, then it automatically creates a peer pressure on them. But otherwise, it's quite difficult to convince the radicals and the religious leaders, especially in our country, to operate or to give us the freedom to operate in their institutes. Number four is, finally, the last point is we have to challenge the insightful narratives of the religious clerics. Like why, especially the Muslim clerics, why they always try to define their religion as a kind of the main religion or the sort of the religious supremacy that they want to maintain. So how can we reduce that narrative to a kind of a humanitarian narrative rather than making it a us versus them conversation? So I think we really need to focus more on these issues and put all them together in one place, and then probably we can have a better understanding of those challenges.
Jessie, quick, snappy comments from you on the same.
Okay, so I'm going to come at it from a communication standpoint. First, I think you need to actually clarify the ages of youth, because there's a broad spectrum depending on the country. So in a communications plan, and when we go in country, we make sure to have clear boundaries to understand what they define as youth, because it could be ages from 16 through 35, or it could be ages from 12 to 20. So I think that's one thing. And when we're developing communication campaigns, again, we apply a holistic approach. So when we're involving youth, we're using youth input. So we're asking youth to be involved aggressively in these campaigns. So not including them into these campaigns is one of the big mistakes that I think that a lot of other donors or other campaigns are often overlooked.
General Ratnayake.
Yeah, if now we are talking about various institutions, how they do things and all that in order to solve a mega issue of this nature. So in my personal experience, I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, when we had the war in Sri Lanka, for 30 long years, we have been fighting to eradicate it, finish it. But later, we realized it is not the case. We all have to get together and have a holistic approach to that. If I may say this in one sentence, ladies and gentlemen, what we did, we got all elements of national power, transformed that into a military capability, and got the soldier to deliver it at the right place, in right form, in right quantity, and right time. So that is how we overcome the terrorism. So similarly, if you want to overcome this radicalization and de-radicalize this process, you have to have a holistic approach. It is not only one organization or one individual or the same. So here in a human being, all this is terrorism or radicalization or whatever extremism you call, it's a state of mind. So it is with individual. So if you come into individual here, there are head, heart, hand. When we want to rehabilitate people, what we did, I understood the ideology of the Tamil Tigers and what they did to the innocent people. Tamil community is very, they consider their education and the religion is much more prioritize their religion and education above everything. So they're a very cultured community. How these people were transformed to be most dangerous terrorists in the world. So we understood that, and we brought them back in the same form. How we did, basically, if I may take 1 minute and explain it, how the people did it, the terrorists, they locked the heart. Even in a human being, you have head, heart, hand. So the psychological, spiritual, and the vocational, 3 aspects. So here, in order to you have a balanced individual, you have to have all these things, 3 things synchronized. Here, the terrorists, what they did, they locked the heart of these top good people and used the mind and the psychological and the vocational, mind and hand only. So what we did, we got them, when we want to rehabilitate, we unlock their heart and put values into it. So that's it. So then they became balanced individuals. So this is how, very simply I'm saying, but if you don't understand this thing, we will not be able to eradicate terrorism or something.
Sumaiya?
I think we've made violence a big virtue as a society. Like, I was really surprised a couple of months ago when India and Pakistan had a little bit of a conflict on the borders, and how much people in the countries, both countries, wanted war on social media. Everybody wanted it so badly, and it was celebratory. And we were celebrating violence, say, 1,000 years ago, perhaps when we were hunter-gatherers and not as domesticated. But then we realized the virtue of cooperation and collaboration, and that's where we thought, okay, let's have a European Union-like situation where we're exchanging ideas and labor and not having a war and just sitting together happily in peace. But then we brought this again, where we're targeting violence with violence and hoping that adding more violence will just somehow make that violence go away. And it's clearly not working. We should really stop rewarding and motivating that kind of violence. I think there's lots of de-radicalization centers and communities working together, but the institutions that do some of these things, for example, one of the good examples is the American military. They have a self-recognized problem of aggression within the institute, within the organization. And I've been speaking with some of those people here. They recognize it, they want to treat with it. They know that combat training mixed with PTSD from, say, Iraq or somewhere like that ends up, not just radicalizing their war veterans, but also, adding to some sort of violent aggression form. I was speaking with a current neo-Nazi, actually. He was in Iraq for 4 years, came back, hated Iraqis, wanted to shoot one, went to prison as a result of that, and came out of prison becoming more radicalized than what he was before, and then founded an organization that actually organized the Charlottesville riots. Now, as an institution, if you don't recognize this is a problem, how are you going to treat it? So, we have to stop putting virtue and, reward and motivation in whatever is causing the violence. And we cannot stop violence with violence. We need to use intelligence and other tools to counter violence.
With that, we do a quick round of questions from the audience. My colleagues Priya and Arsha will be holding the mics. I request you all to keep your questions short, no comments. We can have a lot of conversation on coffee later on. Please. Whoever has a question can please raise their hand. So I think there are no questions that you guys have convinced the audience quite impressively. But here's my question really, is that we talk about stakeholders, community engagement, education, understanding behaviors, but at the end of the day, when you have a violent extremist who's convinced that he is going to die in this path, and he is convinced that his act of killing is actually an act of glory, how do you really bring people first out of that idea? Number one. Number two is that how do you kill that idea from germinating in the first place? Because at the end of the day, somewhere deep down, it's the ideas which basically convince a person to really go forward and turn into a killing machine. So this is my question to all of you, and you can take it as you like it. Yeah.
So if a person wants to go out and be a suicide bomber, wants to kill himself, that person is suicidal. And I'm not sure how other people look at it, because, you know, a lot of the people who, for example, one of the things is depression. About 60% of the people who are depressed have tried to commit suicide or thought about it at some point in their life. And I don't see how that person is actually a healthy person when it comes to mental health. And we're not just talking about something being in the mind. We're talking about this physical problem. The person doesn't think that there is another reason to fix any of his own personal problems apart from killing himself. Now, once we acknowledge that, then there is the next step to it. But this is the first thing that we should come down to, that when someone's even taking a gun and trying to shoot 10 people, he knows that, or she knows that they're not going to get away with it. So what is it that they are thinking when they're going out there and trying to kill a bunch of people, knowing that they might also get killed as a result of that, or at least, you know, have long-term consequences?
General Ratnayake?
Yeah, a lot of people think that these people cannot be converted, rehabilitated. I have done many. There are so many suicide cadres have been transformed to be normal people, disciplined people in the society, and they are doing extremely well now. There are businessmen, there are doctors, there are educated people, got back into normal life and doing extremely well in Sri Lanka. So how this is, I told you, they are convinced, they are being convinced, they are kind of brainwashed by somebody. So then he is convinced. Once a person is convinced, you have to, de-radicalize him. You have to turn him other way. You have to talk to him and you have to see him. So you have to live with him, understand his. So when someone is coming to get himself, suicide bomber, when he comes, he wants to die. So when we get him into the custody, we have to make sure that and instill and give him the value of living has to be put into his mind. So then once that is done, then again, one step by step, you have to take him and get him back to the normalcy. So it's a process. It is not very easy, as I say, but it's a process which we have achieved. So there are a fair number of people who have got through the entire training period of suicide bombing, being transformed to be normal people living in the country now. So it can be done, but the only thing, we have to have the, so how he is being convinced, you got to understand the whole thing and then transform him to be normal.
Jessie?
At that point, I would say, and especially in communications, we're past the planting the seed of doubt. They're already at the point where we're not working at that level with them. So at that moment in time, the preventative side has crossed over into seed.
Saiful, your own experience in Bangladesh, how do you really reconcile or how do you really make a person to give up violence towards a better future?
I think the better alternative narratives actually worked in our case. So during our media literacy classes, the moment we started showing them the real stories and the alternative narratives to them, then they realized that, okay, there is a better understanding on this issue, and we were actually deprived from getting these things. So as simple as it is, you have to have a better alternatives in front of those who got radicalized, and at the same time, you need to have a structured counseling process. And it can be started for the new generation from the school level, or for the youth like who has crossed the age limit of 25 plus. For them, you need to have a structured counseling sessions in association with the psychologists or those who are working in this field.
Matthew, I'm someone who looks at the security side of it. We talk about preemptive strikes against terrorists. Can there be a preemptive narrative really against terrorists? can education really be that preemptive narrative? What do you think?
I think narratives are difficult, and there are opportunities in anyone's life for them both to be persuaded of a narrative that is destructive and closed to the world, essentially, if we talk about open versus closed. And there are opportunities in their lives to make them open and more empathetic. And there's interesting neuroscience on this in terms of when you start, you asked me the question earlier, which I didn't answer, but there are interventions throughout the educational stage that can equip people to be more empathetic, to be more open. And that needs to start in our education systems at the very earliest stage. So we need to be ensuring that pre-service training and in-service training for teachers equips them with the ability to do that. The whole way you can run a classroom and a school can have a profound effect on an individual, no matter what the educational environment. Often people will say to me, well, gosh, people don't even have access to numeracy and literacy skills. We're trying to develop that. Yes, but alongside that, we can embed these skills in the training as we're doing that. And we're working with other NGOs that work in the kind of broader education space to ensure that that can happen as early as possible. There are also opportunities. How do you create opportunities for young people in the classroom to have their voices heard, to discuss things, to not have narratives limited to black and white? Martin Rose for the British Council has done some very good research on rote learning and its very negative impacts that can have. So black and white thinking, which is then carried on in life when you face other decisions. So how can we give young people the toolkit to be able to question, explore, and then take that out into the world? When they interact, whether it's online or offline, when these ideas are presented with them, how can they navigate their environment? Mercy Corps done some very interesting research in Somalia around access to education, and actually young people who are given secondary education without civics education on this sort of skill set being brought in. Whilst their participation in political violence decreased, their support for it increased, because actually they were able to better, because of the education, they were able to better understand and articulate the grievances. So actually, unless you gave them a skill set where you were able to do that, but that was also possible to do. So in the groups, they did that. Exeter University undertook a study of our program Generation Global a couple of years ago, and it showed that you can increase, they came up using traditional research techniques with a measure of open-mindedness, that you can promote open-mindedness in young people through programs such as ours, which does give them an inoculation from these radical narratives. If I may, I just wanted to pick up on the point. I think it's interesting on this sort of kind of suicide bomber and that difficult. I mean, many people are forced into suicide bombing. They have no choice but to do it. Our Global Extremism Monitor talked about that last year. Also, I think the narratives that people have in that, the lack of religious literacy, and other panels have talked about this, it's important to teach religious literacy in school and religious tradition, the diversity of tradition, so that young people can navigate that space. Sorry.
I'm sorry we're running out of time. You can maybe 30 seconds to wrap up.
Yeah, no, so just on that, I think, often those that would take their own life on the battlefield in that context are not kind of hopeless, as sadly many depressed people are when they take their own lives, but actually have a false hope in something. And so how can we equip them to kind of recognize that kind of false hope isn't a human narrative, isn't consistent with the true understanding of the world?
On that note, we wrap up this panel hoping and praying for a positive future and hoping that 2030 is a more peaceful world. Our next panel is Real Villains and Real Violence, when the glitz of cinema meets violent extremism. With this, we break into a short tea and coffee break. And after that, as I told you, we have two important panels. We'll be having a panel on cinema and countering violent extremism, and the last panel of the day will be about tech and terror. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, all of you.